my dad was in the Philippines, and he was training for the invasion. So what can I say? Yeah. Anything that got him home is very much fine with me.
Welcome back to the Rad Lab podcast. I am Dr. David Dan, and with me is Dale Enzer. This podcast is brought to you by the Tennessee Tech University Chemistry Department. And combined, we have over 50 years of radiochemistry experience. And today we're going to be talking about the Oppenheimer movie that's coming out by Christopher Nolan. We are pretty excited about it. We actually just watched the trailer for it. And we've kind of seen this before. We've seen attempts at something like this before. And what are your thoughts on it?
Well, when I initially heard about the movie, I was, oh no, here we go again, because I had seen, for example, the movie Fat Man, Little Boy with Paul Newman, which did some things with the timeline that were not correct. And then there was the disaster of a made-for-TV program called Manhattan, which turned into more like an evening soap opera. So those types of things in the past have led me to think, I'm not really excited about a movie such as this. However, at just watching the trailer, I noticed that a lot of the pictures that they had in the trailer represented areas of New Mexico, which I was familiar with since I had spent some time at Los Alamos and also visited Trinity Site.
The movie definitely feels New Mexico. The landscape and everything feels like New Mexico, which is great. And I was actually in Los Alamos, working at Los Alamos when they started shooting it, and they even got extras from the lab. So there was a whole big process behind that, which is kind of amazing. And this is kind of testament to the director, Christopher Nolan, which I've loved pretty much every one of his movies, and he usually does a good job of keeping things to historical facts. Like the movie he did, Dunkirk, which was a great movie, and I'm really interested to see what he does with the movie, and he's probably one of the only directors I would trust with a movie like this. And even the buildings in the trailer, when they're inside and they're in the labs of Los Alamos, it looks and feels like Los Alamos National Lab, because those buildings haven't changed or very little since they were built. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the great things about it, is I really feel that, it feels right just from the trailer. But, this could be, honeypotting us in some way. So we've actually found out that we were probably at the Trinity site visiting, because you can only visit twice a year.
Right.
I don't know if they've reopened since COVID, but before COVID, you could only visit twice a year.
Yeah,
right?
It was October and May, I believe.
Yeah, and the landscape looks pretty spot on based on our experiences being there, and we both remember them being just how long the line would be. Right.
Yeah, we had left the hotel at about 6 in the morning and got to Stalin's Gate, and it was already a mile or more of cars backed up to go through the gate.
This kind of stuff still garners a lot of interest from people, and I think the timing of this movie is kind of spot on, because of everything that's been going on in the world too, right? With wars and things like that, and concerns of World War III possibly, and things like that. This kind of is bringing back those kind of memories and understanding of what this could all turn out to be, right?
Well, the one thing I hope the movie brings out is the science and the amount of work that was associated with the development of the Manhattan Project, and the types of things that had to be, the types of problems that had to be overcome that normally would have taken years, and they were able to do it in a lot less time.
And the scale up and just the level at which everything was done is just something that we haven't seen since and probably will never see. Trying to get all those people focused on the same goal.
Right.
Right. And what are your opinions of the visuals, like the actors and things like that they chose?
I thought the actor for Oppenheimer was pretty much spot on. Very slender. I assume he's going to be wearing his pork pie hat, which and the only one I was a little bit concerned about is General Groves was described as about 6'2" and weighed somewhere around 250 to 275 pounds. And, I don't think Matt Damon is gonna.
He's gonna fit that bill.
Yeah, I don't think he is. But and the other question I have is how are they going to bring in Oppenheimer's background, his upbringing, and his experience in Europe. He graduated with a chemistry degree from Harvard and then went to Cambridge, but his experience at Cambridge was not very good because that's an experimental, hands-on type of place, and from everything I've read in Oppenheimer's background, he was not a good hands-on person, in the lab.
Yeah, he was a liability in the
lab. Yeah, and it wasn't until he got into the theory of quantum mechanics that in Germany that he actually began to really develop.
No, that's awesome. I hope, for 3 hours, right? The movie's 3 hours. Hopefully they can touch on everything. But you mentioned you're reading a few sources. This movie is actually based on a book.
Right.
Right. That you're currently reading.
I've read it in the past, and so I'm rereading it now and going through some things. So I'm be interested to see how much of the book is in the movie.
And if you're interested in the book that this movie is based on, it's based off American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. So if you're interested in looking for that book, it's also an audiobook because I've looked it up because I might start playing it for my commute. Check it out, definitely see, and we'll definitely give you our opinions on how well we think Christopher Nolan hit the mark, which I believe he will. Are there any other concerns or anything
it'll be interesting to know how they bring out the latter part where his security clearance was stripped. And all that relationship that goes into that.
Yeah, the kind of fall from grace that he went through, right? Because he was, at the top,
right?
And he really got drugged down, and I think that's what makes this story so interesting.
And it was created or orchestrated by people who were originally his biggest proponents and best friends.
Yeah, I'm really interested as well to see that rise and fall and how deep they go into it. And one of the things that I'm really interested to see is how maybe this movie changes people's perceptions, or just kind of brings back the ideas of the nuclear bomb and things like that. Because right now it's kind of a word thrown around, and I think hopefully this brings back like the true meaning of it. And the one thing I'm worried about really is hopefully this doesn't deter people from like nuclear power, because we've talked about this before. Like, we're able to separate nuclear power from the nuclear bomb, but the general population doesn't necessarily have that capability because of I guess lack of education or understanding to separate those two different things.
Right. Yeah, they are totally different, and but a lot of people just automatically put them together.
Yeah, and they think if they have a nuclear power plant in their state, it's going to blow up and it's going to destroy half the state or something like that. One thing about the trailer that I thought was kind of funny, and hopefully there's a little bit more tidbits and they keep it some parts light, was when General Groves was asking about, is this going to destroy the world if we do this?
Right. Yeah. Well, that was, I guess it was Oppenheimer was really upset with Enrico Fermi because he started a pool of whether it would ignite the atmosphere.
So they were generally concerned about igniting that.
But I think it was Hans Bertha that did a calculation that showed that it wouldn't.
And it's that conversation in that trailer is such a scientist to a non-scientist conversation, because Groves, he's like, I want it to be zero chance. And he's like, well, that's not how the world works. It's a near zero chance. There's always a possibility.
Right.
And that's I've had that conversation probably a few times with students and other things. But yeah, it kind of hits home with that conversation. I think we're both excited to see this movie. This is seeing the movie, so we're just kind of giving you our opinions. And when we see it in the next 30 seconds or so, we'll be talking about how we enjoy the movie, and we hope you're along with us with that journey. So we just got back. We saw the movie. And we just want to go through our thoughts and just kind of go through this movie with you guys. And first off, what were your thoughts, Dale?
Well, first of all, I was relieved that I think in general all the scientific aspect of the movie was correct. Pictures of Trinity site, if having been there, they were spot on. The portrayal of the problems getting to Trinity was accurately described. So in that aspect, I was relieved that they didn't twist anything out of proportion. I was surprised that the movie was done in such a way that you could follow what was going on. There's so much information there, but it did focus on Oppenheimer and his demise, really orchestrated by Strauss.
Yeah, it's a Greek tragedy in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I thought the movie was great. I thought they did an amazing job. My hunch was correct. Christopher Nolan did kind of what he always does, and yeah, I think they stuck to the script. I think they, like you've told me, they stuck to the book really well. I didn't see any really glaring kind of issues with it, and it was an emotional movie, which I wasn't expecting it to be. By the end of it, I could feel the weight of it all.
Yes, it certainly was an anti-war movie.
Yeah.
And for younger people who had not lived through the Cold War era, in my case, we were talking, my wife and I and several other people were talking about when we were in elementary school, there was a civil defense practice of cover your face and get under your desk, if there was a possibility of a nuclear attack.
And hopefully this movie brought this out to a lot of people and brought this to the forefront, because I think nowadays the idea of nuclear warfare is kind of just like this kind of figment of imagination, or is just not taken as seriously as it truly needs to be.
Yeah.
And I think they did a great job of, bringing that back in a lot of ways.
Yeah. They did it without showing some of the horror pictures that they could have shown as a result of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, there were glimpses, right. But I think they definitely did it in a tasteful way,
right.
Without trying to scare too much. But again, it was about Oppenheimer and not necessarily the after effects of the bomb.
Yeah.
But overall, I think if you haven't seen the movie yet, I would say go see it. It doesn't feel like 3 hours.
No.
I think we were talking that we've been in research talks that were 30 minutes that felt longer than that movie. And I think the pacing of it, the timeline kind of jumping,
Right,
helped.
being told from more or less Oppenheimer's memories over his early years and then of the later years.
It's just even though it's not a Marvel movie, there's not a lot of action. But the movie feels like it's going full speed, and you're just in it. You know, there's a couple slow points, I think, but for me, I felt like I was in it. And maybe that's just me being a radiochemist and being more invested in it. But, you know, for me, I thought, you know, it was a great movie. Okay, so, you know, most people want to hear if they got anything wrong. And, you know, we don't want to hold you guys too long. So I'll let you go first.
Okay.
What do you think they got wrong?
Well, not necessarily wrong, but was a little hyped, and that was with the apple and Niels Bohr. The apple is in the book, the apple is for his supervisor Brackett, but the way it was portrayed in the movie is that Niels Bohr had picked up the apple, the poison apple, and Oppenheimer knocked it away. That was a little play on that system. The one that I saw specifically was the story. It had someone in a barber's chair reading the New York Times about fission, and then jumping out of the barber's chair and racing to the lab at Berkeley and announcing fission, and Oppenheimer to Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer immediately says, well, theoretically it can't happen, and then a little bit later, after seeing that it does happen, and that was a good demonstration to see those large oscilloscope peaks. But the person that this really happened was to Luis Alvarez and not Lawrence. And in the movie, it was sort of led you to believe it was Lawrence who did it. And Luis Alvarez, who was also on the faculty there, and he went to his graduate student who would have discovered fission if he had known what to look for.
Yeah.
So that was the only one that I really saw was a little bit of a stretch. Their timing on the amount of plutonium available when they gave that talk in Los Alamos is probably out.
Yeah, when they were putting the marbles
Right.
The timing and the ramp up of that I thought was a little bit not as within timeline, right? Because when they started making plutonium, it was like
the first amounts came from the Clinton works in January of '44. And it wasn't until January of '45 they got anything from Hanford.
That brings up one of the things that I saw, and I could be wrong, but the Hanford site, when he was talking about how they were going to orchestrate the design, where the labs were going to be, how it was going to be all centralized towards New Mexico and things, they mentioned Hanford site. But at that time, I thought Hanford was not even a thought yet when they were initially talking about Los Alamos.
Right. I think that was done before they even had the CP1 in Chicago, and they knew that you could build a nuclear reactor.
Yeah, and that's not true, right?
Yeah.
But that's again, I think we like we said we're kind of nitpicking here with what's wrong. But yeah, the Hanford site wasn't established until after they figured out in Chicago how to produce the plutonium on a much larger scale.
Right.
And that was one of the things I saw, and I was like, that's kind of off. But I can't. Again, we're picking at straws right now. And for me, I guess we talked about it, but the compartmentalization. I didn't know that the compartmentalization, I thought that was wrong. The movie had it wrong. I thought it was much more strict at Los Alamos, but you were telling me, no, that it was more free like that.
From my understanding, they started with a Robert Serber, and they sort of did a little bit of that in the movie where they never even introduced the Robert Serber was giving the talk, and that was the case of where Oppenheimer came by and said, "Don't use the word bomb, use gadget."
Yeah.
But that was a talk given to all new in inductees, not really inductees, but new.
Kind of. They kind of mentioned it was like a cult kind of in Los Alamos, so maybe a little bit.
Yeah. So when you initially came on site, that was given to you. So I'd say that sort of shows compartmentalization went
out the window.
Yeah.
But were they actually calling it plutonium?
Oh, no.
At the time.
They had several code words, and I don't know what was. They were probably calling it 49, and I know that at Chicago they called it copper because there were several times where they had to say "honest to God copper" to mean they really wanted copper.
Yeah.
But they would just say copper. They were referring to plutonium.
Yeah, because I was waiting for him because he said, "Call it gadget." And I was waiting for him to say, also, don't call it plutonium, call it, something else. I was waiting for that moment, but because, they were trying to keep that a little bit more secretive. But I guess, and maybe in Los Alamos, they were a little bit more cavalier with their information.
Well, the people living there were pretty much stuck behind the fence.
Yeah.
Really. Although, they would get, I think they could go down to Santa Fe once a month, maybe.
Wow. And that's it. They couldn't go anywhere else. So they were there for those 2 years in Los Alamos. That was it.
Yeah.
And I wish they would have shown more of the ramp up of the production of the isotopes, right? Because that was such a great endeavor of going from micrograms to now kilograms in the span of months, a year, maybe. Yeah. So it was one of the greatest ramp ups in production history, really.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought they were going to show that with the marbles. Because they were trickling them in, and I thought one day they were going to walk in and they were just going to dump a bunch in and show that there was a big ramp up once Hanford got going and things like that.
Yeah, and they didn't make in my mind, enough emphasis on the implosion device and why they were testing the implosion device, but they didn't test the gun device.
Yeah, yep, that's the one thing. Yeah, they never mentioned why they never tested uranium, and they knew it was going to work, right? they all of the math and everything showed that the gun device was always going to work, and they didn't need to test it.
Even though the math showed that the implosion device may not work.
Yep. and also the implosion device having to trigger all those explosives to go off exactly at the same time sounds kind of trivial now with all the technology and electronics we have, but back then that was not a trivial thing. That was an extremely difficult task just for the explosives.
Right.
To be timed like that. Okay, so again, we're nitpicking a little bit, but there was not a lot wrong with the movie. If anything, you can really call wrong. Again, we think they did an amazing job. Okay, so if you don't want to hear too many spoilers, if you haven't seen it, maybe stop listening at this point, because I think we're going to start going through the timeline and really talking through a lot of these thoughts about and how we thought they were portrayed and what we thought was good and maybe what we thought they could have done better. So, spoiler alert, stop listening if you don't want any spoilers at this point. Okay, so from the beginning, you mentioned the apple. There was also, I thought there were thoughts of it didn't actually happen, he only thought about it. Is that true?
Well, that seemed to me one of the ways that it could have been interpreted is that this he was upset with Brackett, who was the instructor in the lab where he was, because he he wanted to go hear Niels Bohr, and Brackett told him, no, you've got to stay here. Mm-hmm. So I could visualize him seeing, oh, I've got cyanide, and this is his apple.
Yeah.
But then later, when it was Niels Bohr picked up the apple and was about to eat it, and he knocks it away. So
artistic liberty, let's
say.
say.
Yeah. So that could very well have been a dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but the one thing that was very evident is his poor situation at the Cavendish labs. Mm-hmm. At this point, here is, he got to work for Rutherford's group. That would be sort of ideal, and he was having a very poor experience there. And it wasn't until he got into the theory and the quantum mechanics, which is what Bohr told him to do, that he sort of emerged out of that group.
Yeah, and they showed really how bad he was in lab, because by all accounts he was not good with his hands,
right?
Which is kind of crazy to think about, that he was a little bit clumsy in the lab.
Yeah,
and one of the things that I really liked was how they portrayed an idea, an idea festering in your mind and growing until, dreaming about it, thinking about it all the time. I think any scientist can say they've had, I think it was dramatized, but I think any scientist can say they've had an experience like that, with an idea, with an experiment that, they've always thought about. My students have told me they've dreamed about some of the experiments that we've been doing and things like that. And I've had dreams, and I've had somewhat nightmares, you might call, because, I don't know if you've ever had this dream, but a lot of radiochemists have this dream. It's a dream where you go into a hot lab with no gloves, or a hot hood, and you're touching radioactive material without gloves. I've had that dream, and I know of quite a lot of other people that have had that dream. Working with californium and things like that without gloves is a big no-no, but I loved that, that build up of an idea and thinking about it, eating at you, and you can't shake it, and it really grows.
The one thing that was a little bit lacking in that early part was his learning of how the Jewish people were being treated. And there was just one or two comments where I've got to help my colleagues that are escaping from Germany. And that was really one of the things that I think was a driving force for him to get involved in the the Manhattan Project to begin with. And that could have received a little bit more emphasis. And also Izzy Rabin, that friendship kind of came in and out. And as one of the students that went to see the movie with us said, he really needed subtitles to identify the various scientists that were involved, which it was hard to keep them straight if you were trying to.
Yeah, if you haven't read the book, or you don't know much about the story, keeping all the names straight and knowing who's important and who really played a big role that maybe just had a little bit of screen time was very hard, especially with the bouncing back and forth. I agree. There was points where I'm like, who is that guy? I know he's important. I can't remember his name now. And I got kind of lost a little bit with the names as well. I think that's something I wish was a little bit better.
The time at Los Alamos was pretty much, the picture of Bathtub Row, and then I really thought Kitty would have said, "Oh, we have a bathtub." No, she says we'd have no kitchen. So
slight oversight.
Yeah. Well, they ate in Fuller Lodge, and the pictures of Fuller were what you see pretty much today. I thought it was good, and even some of the portrayal of the lab, and I don't know how they mocked them up, but they look similar to what has been described of Tech Area 1 in some of the other books.
And you can still see the first guard gate in Los Alamos as well. So if you ever are in New Mexico and you want to see the first guard gate, you can go and take pictures at it.
That has been preserved, yeah.
One of the things, well, you can say a lot of those buildings have been preserved because they're still working in some of them.
The one thing I thought that they missed was to show a picture of the original road that you had to go on to get up there. And there are pieces of that you can still see as you climb the hill.
If you're ever in Los Alamos, the main road to get to that initial guard gate, it's on the edge of a mesa. It's going up the edge of a mesa. So that was the same.
And as you're going up there, you can see off to your left a small road.
The one thing that the video or just being on screen does not give New Mexico justice is the vastness and it's called the Land of Enchantment. And if you ever go out there, just the vastness and just how far you can see the mountains and how they're so in your face and the beauty of it, it's really hard to capture that. They did a good job, but it still doesn't do it.
Yeah, we never had a shot of the San de Cristo Mountains.
Yeah.
There was never a good shot of that. I remember when I was there in March, they were snow-covered, and so in the mornings with the sun, it was really a beautiful sight. And then also the Valle Grande, there was no shots of that.
You've only been on the East Coast or the east side of the U.S., please go out to New Mexico, go out to that part of the Southwest. It's beautiful. One thing before we go on to past his early life, they never mentioned that he came from money. Right. That never was a big deal, which is kind of, I think it's not necessarily an important point, but I think it's something that also needs to be said, especially if you look into more of his history, that he did come from money. And, maybe that gave him the freedom to be as free thinking as he was. I thought they were going to mention maybe something. Maybe he was going to drive a nice car or something. But
yeah, well, his education was private schools. And he went through Harvard in 3 years with a chemistry degree. So
that could have played a role, but yeah, I thought they were going to mention it, but it's not a lot of people. I thought before, I think you told me that he came from money. I thought he was just just a regular guy coming from New York or something. His family was hardworking. I'm sure they were hardworking, but it is kind of an interesting thought. Okay, so we get through his early years, and then he starts to blossom into this quantum mechanics genius, right? So how did you think about the build-up to where they approached him to Los Alamos and things like that?
Well, that also included sort of the 30s, and also showed his involvement with the Communist Party of America and donating money to the Spanish Civil War, and just his involvement also in the unionization of students at Berkeley, which is what really drove Lawrence crazy. Lawrence was really upset with Oppenheimer, that Oppenheimer would even consider that.
And they're still unionized. California grad students are still unionized to this day. And for better or for worse, they're unionized. That build up to Los Alamos, it showed a lot of his communist parties, and we started to see maybe a little bit, I guess we can talk about it now, but his womanizing tendencies.
Right, yeah. But also his ability to attract bright young physicists. And his goal when he went there was to create a quantum mechanical school in the United States.
Because there was none before.
There had not been.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, he was the father of that in the United States.
And then some of his best papers were produced in the late 30s, and these were all astrophysical papers that done strictly in theory that in a lot of cases no one really understood.
Yeah. And there was no real way to prove it
at that point.
At that time, yeah. Because, he predicted black holes.
Right.
And, and we just recently got our first photos of a black hole. Not that many years ago.
Yeah.
And so, which he probably should have won a Nobel Prize at some point.
I've read where if he had lived and been alive when they had discovered the white dwarfs and been able to show that what his prediction is what was happened, then he may have been nominated for a Nobel Prize. But he had by that time had passed.
Mm-hmm. And he never got a Nobel for, I guess, fathering the atomic bomb or anything like that. No. I guess that would kind of be against Nobel, his wishes maybe for the prize as well, because we all know the reasoning behind Nobel's struggles.
The one thing also that I thought was done well is his exclusion initially from the Manhattan Project, and it wasn't until he said, "Okay, I'm done with all of this," that Lawrence would allow him in.
Yeah, he had to renounce his the communism, I guess, or communist.
Renounce his support of the Union and so forth.
So Groves approaches him. So Groves actually did approach him, or did he go to Groves?
No, Groves came there.
Okay.
Groves took over in, I think it's September of 42, and he immediately made a trek around and visited the sites. And he came to Berkeley because of Lawrence, but he ended up at that point realizing that Oppenheimer was more of a theorist, and so he went to see him, and I think that was the first time they met.
Was Oppenheimer, because in the movie they make it seem like he's a great strategist in organizing people and organizing things. Is that true?
Well, the thing I remember is when he was appointed leader, everybody said he can't run a McDonald's.
Yeah.
Well, of course, there wasn't a McDonald's there at that time, but he couldn't run a hamburger stand. Mm-hmm. He had no experience with organizing and seeing through a project. One of the biggest complaints about Oppenheimer, and this was one made by Niels Bohr, is that he would come up with an idea, he would sort of publish the idea, but he would never follow through with the idea.
Yeah, because he was like, he went to the chalkboard. This is where, Chicago's going to be, this, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and everything, and we're all going to be towards New Mexico. It's all going to be centralized New Mexico. And I was like, I don't remember that being the case, because you kind of saw, they were saying, he couldn't, be in charge of a burger stand, but then he's organizing this complete, buildup of the bomb. So I think we've already mentioned that Los Alamos, they did a great job of representing it. And I think there was one scene that I was like, I think I've been there before, that they shot when he was in the woods. This is after Jeannie had passed away.
Mm. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he's crying, and that is in Los Alamos. The only reason I know that is because of rock climbing and the boulder he was leaning up against. I'm pretty sure I've maybe walked up or anything like that. But I was like, that's Los Alamos. They did a great job of showing Los Alamos, and I think we mentioned it previously. But so did no one care about his womanizing tendencies, or did it ever get him in trouble? Because he was kind of a homewrecker if we look at the story.
Well, the FBI obviously knew about it because they had him under surveillance and had passed that information on to the security people, and the security people were ready to take him out and shoot him, I think. But Groves said, he's somebody I need, got to have him, and so that was the end of it. When the general talks to a lieutenant colonel, the lieutenant colonel says, "Yes, sir,"
Yeah.
and does it. And then they did transfer Posh to the Alos mission, which was the mission to discover what the Germans were doing. So,
Was Posh really that harsh? By accounts, he was that
yeah, he was pretty
severe.
Yeah, and the other thing there, when you talk about Los Alamos, is the recruitment and how difficult it was for Oppenheimer to say, "I want you to come. I can't tell you what you're going to work on, and I can't tell you how long you're going to have to be here," and so forth. You can imagine somebody approaching you, "Hey, I need you to come work on a project. Can't tell you what it is right now, but."
I would have it with the caveat of, "Can I leave at any time?" And they would say no. But and I think a great line was when they were on the train, and he was like, we could do this faster if we flew. And he was like, "We're too important. It's too risky." And I thought that was a great moment, saying, really showing like how serious they were taking it. Like they weren't even willing to fly because it could have been too risky, and they couldn't be lost, right?
Well, and that's why they all had drivers. They couldn't even drive their own vehicles.
One of the things I wish they got into was the fake names they had for these scientists.
Yeah.
I think that would have been really showing them kind of wandering around Santa Fe and trying to figure out where this mystery city is,
Well, when Niels Bohr came to the U.S., he was assigned Nicholas Baker, and so but then his keepers realized that there he was carrying his satchel, which had on the side of his satchel Niels Bohr.
Yeah, and they had all kinds of names for the foreign scientists that they were bringing in, and I thought that would have been kind of a nice moment. Yeah. So I think we've talked about Los Alamos and the buildup, and I guess we can talk about the bomb, right?
Yeah.
So. What were your thoughts about how they portrayed the bomb?
Well, we already touched on the implosion idea, that really wasn't developed very well, and why it was such a problem, theoretically as well as just building the lenses for the implosion device, and why you needed the implosion device. They spent more time sort of talking about the super than they did about the development of the Trinity.
Yeah.
So that was, but again, this was talking about Oppenheimer, not about the science.
Yeah.
You and I wanted the
See
science.
The science, yeah. That's for sure. I wish there was a little bit more science, but I understand why. It was already a 3-hour movie. They couldn't make it 4.
Yeah. And the build up and the to the detonation of it and all that seemed that from what I've read in the different books is exactly what happened. You had 10,000 yards away, and so you had three sites there, and then the people on the hill, which was 10, 20 miles away, and then I thought it was good the way they did first of all the explosion and the light, and then a little bit later came the blast wave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was, I think, knowing Christopher Nolan, he probably did some research on that, and also like how long it would take for the shockwave to get there, and that was great. Like the silence and just really seeing the light and everything, and waiting for the boom.
Yeah,
it was great. And that was not CGI. That was an actual explosion they let off to simulate the bomb.
Okay.
Oh, well, going back to Los Alamos, one of the things is they must have shot that movie in springtime because of how windy it was.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you're ever in New Mexico, when spring comes, the winds come. And the weather and the winds are so predictable. That's why they have the balloon fiesta there, because the winds are predictable. So you know every spring the winds are going to come, and it gets even windier out there. And I thought that was the one thing I kind of chuckled at. It was like how windy it was, and I was like, they must have shot this in March if it was this windy all the time, because no other time of the year is it that windy.
Yeah. And then, of course, in the summertime, you have the quote-unquote rain,
Yeah.
the thunderstorms, which often come with lightning and no rain.
Yep. Yep. And the weather, like the way, Oppenheimer was like, it's going to break at 5:30. Just wait for it. The weather's going to break. The weather is pretty predictable. And that's why they love doing, hot air balloons, because you can't control them. So you need to have very predictable weather.
Yeah.
I guess kind of backtrack a little bit. Sorry. Teller, the way he was portrayed, and how he was more of a thorn in the side, and then you brought up the super, and how there was so much talk of the super, and I kind of understand why it was brought up, because that kind of leaned into Strauss, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But Teller, he seemed kind of a thorn in the side of Oppenheimer.
They were initially friends. That he had met Teller when he was in Germany, but he was a distraction. And so that's why in that one scene where he puts Teller in his own division and tells Teller, I'll meet with you once a week for 1 hour. And then Teller's wanting to leave, and he says, no, you can't leave.
You literally can't leave.
You can't leave. And Teller, I think, held a grudge.
Mm. And that showed with his indictment of Oppenheimer later, right? But we'll get to that, which is kind of a mess in itself in history. But so the bomb, I think you mentioned it, great representation of it. I love telling the story of the sunscreen.
Oh, yeah. The sunscreen and you saw them with the heavy
the welding glasses
and the welder's glasses, and then the two, I can't remember if it was two or one, that didn't put on glasses, and he was blinded for a certain period of time, but he got his sight back.
Yeah. I wish they would have played that up more. They were like, oh, it's going to block the UV, this glass. It's like, okay, sure, another great line when they were saying, was like, when they were asking if 10,000 yards is far enough. Yeah. He was like, well, it's based on your calculations, so I thought that was a great moment. So the bomb, and then comes the big question, should we use the bomb?
Right.
And that meeting they were in, with the higher-ups, I guess, and they were trying to decide which city they were going to do it in. Do you think that conversation was as light as it was in the movie?
I haven't done a lot of reading in that area, and so I would imagine that the decision to use it was already made by higher-ups, and it was simply a matter of picking out a target.
He was like, I don't want Kyoto because Kyoto is, I vacation there.
Secretary Stinson.
Stimson. It just, and maybe it was, I think it really took, I think maybe it showed the politicians and how far removed they are from, they didn't see that explosion. They didn't see, they don't understand the devastation that these scientists knew was going to come. And so the reasoning that they always used is it was going to save American lives. It was going to save Japanese lives because the fighting was so fierce in the Pacific. I know it's a touchy topic for a lot of people.
No.
But what are your thoughts on the use of, and maybe put it in more context?
My dad was in the Philippines, and he was training for the invasion. So what can I say?
Yeah.
Anything that got him home is very much fine with me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it did save lives because of understanding Japanese culture and things. They weren't going to stop. And it's like if someone invaded the U.S., would we stop? How hard would we fight?
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard to see another way of that war ending. And the closer you get to Japan, the harder it's going to be. And like you said, there was no question by the U.S. If you asked any U.S. soldier then,
Right.
any military general, there was no question. And I've actually gotten to speak with some people from Japan, older people, and their understanding. And from what they tell me, their first thing they think about is they woke the bear. They understand they attacked the U.S. They understand there had to be retaliation. They understand the first bomb being dropped, the devastation. I'm not sure exactly on the timeline, but how much time was there between the first and the second bomb? It wasn't that far apart, right? It was maybe days.
Yeah, I think it was days.
And they think, from their perspective, obviously, these people I spoke with, they weren't generals or anything or had family of generals, but the use of the second bomb they view as unnecessary. And maybe those few days weren't enough time for them they were still sifting through rubble. People literally disappeared from the planet in a lot of ways, and they didn't understand. They don't necessarily agree with this second use. But in the movie, their justification was, we have to show them that we can do it again.
Yeah.
And I kind of understand that justification, but hindsight's always 20/20.
Right.
And it got the end result that they wanted.
Right.
And which was bring American soldiers home, save American lives, and at the end of the day, save a lot of Japanese lives as well. And they didn't target the biggest populated city in Japan because they knew the devastation. Okay, so I guess now we can get into the politics that kind of plagued Oppenheimer the back half of his career and life.
Well, the biggest thing, Oppenheimer was not wanting to get into an arms race. And so that's why he sort of downplayed the development of the super. And as being on the Atomic Energy Commission, he was able to slow that research down, although Truman made the decision that they were going to go into that. But I think Oppenheimer felt that the American people did not understand the implication of building bigger and bigger bombs.
Yeah, they didn't understand that you're kind of antagonizing the other to do the same.
Right.
And there was a line in the movie where what's the difference if we drown in 1,000 feet of water or 10,000 feet of water? What's the difference, And, that was kind of maybe the justification that a lot of them used. Right. And something they didn't get into was like the testing of H-bombs and things like that. And, the negative effects that had on a lot of different things.
Right.
And with underground testing, atmospheric testing in the ocean, the great miscalculation they had.
Little island no longer exists.
Yes, Bikini Atoll. Was that the one they miscalculated?
It was one of the super.
Yeah.
And
it was the miscalculation with lithium, I believe. And it destroyed half of a Navy fleet.
Well, yeah.
So, they never got into those effects. I think a visualization or maybe a comparison would have been kind of nice to show, I guess, a more modern use of a nuclear weapon. It was already so long.
Well, I think the one thing the end of the movie goes into is the hearing that was done. And it wasn't really it was a political hearing, not a judicial hearing. So the rules that you and I are familiar with in terms of evidence and so forth were thrown out the window. Mm-hmm. It was basically a kangaroo court, one-sided. We're not gonna
give you your clearance back.
Right. Yeah.
By all accounts, this was all orchestrated by Strauss.
Right. Even though he wasn't.
He wasn't a scientist per se.
But he was the one that gave all that information to the prosecution.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the defense was not allowed to see any of it because it was all classified.
Yep.
And Oppenheimer simply allowed it to happen. He basically, and this was portrayed in the movie, he basically was sacrificial.
And the backstabbing of Teller, even though they had a tough relationship, even him going back on him in those hearings. Were there any other scientists that kind of turned their back on him or stabbed him in the back?
No, he pretty much had a support there. The way that committee or that hearing worked is like when they put Groves to the question, okay, would you clear him now? Taking it totally out of context. And of course he had to say, no, I wouldn't have cleared him. Yeah. And I think that was the same with several other people who were supportive of him, but the way the politics were arranged and the question asked.
Yeah, no, it was definitely not fair. It was not a fair fight. But, I think there were always his supporters that stuck with him. And you could see some of that support. And his wife, even though from his transgressions, she still had his back. And I thought that was beautiful. And, not shaking Teller's hand at the end of the movie. I heard some nice, kind of small cheers in the crowd when that happened. Did they ever mend their relationship?
I'm not sure.
He seems like a forgiving guy, though.
Yeah. He continued to lecture through it, and even though there were some places that he was not accepted, and of course when that happened, there were large protests. But, it sort of took the fire out of him.
To have done your job and done it well and done it for your country, and then all that be put in question, I think it would kill anybody. And I can only it was just such a big fall from grace, and for it to be orchestrated by someone who was jealous and
and maybe for no reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's at least the last part of the movie shows that they weren't even talking about Strauss, Einstein and Oppenheimer.
So was that conversation real between Einstein and Oppenheimer at the lake? Or what do you think that was for poeticness?
I think it logically could have been real because Einstein was the sort of the birth of the baby with E equal MC squared, and Oppenheimer is taking that equation and showing that what happens when you do that. So,
and they did have a relationship.
Yeah.
And like he said, he's like, I already know him, kind of thing. And also, Strauss's ego was on display in the movie. And I think that it really shows how many egos there are in science.
Well, and I didn't catch the phrase that Oppenheimer used to sort of mock him about exporting
isotopes. He said something. It's like as if we exported beer and they would be able to make a bomb out of it or something like that. It was a rather. Nowadays that's nothing, but I guess back then, I guess he took it very personally. Clearly.
Clearly he did, and he, and after he felt that Einstein was ignoring him or putting him in, and after that, then he was looking for anything
to
get back at
him, And, unfortunately, in science, there can be a lot of egos. There can be a lot of that, and, a little bit of that's on display. And, ideas get stolen, people get scooped. It's, unfortunately, it can be a dirty game sometimes.
Well, yeah, and but I think, the movie did a good job of, as I said, sort of take that committee hearing sort of took the life out of him.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And even though he lived for almost another 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Final conversation where we finally get to hear what he said to Einstein. I think that was a great way to sum up the movie.
Yeah.
And, bring it all home and, put the weight of it all into that one scene I think it was great. And they mentioned a couple of times in the movie, he gave us the ability to destroy ourselves, and, what are we going to do about it? And that's the big question that we kind of are still trying to answer.
And today.
Yeah, and hopefully we can figure it out for everyone's sake.
Well, in my summary, I'd say it is well worth your time. You really don't. I did not feel like it was 3 hours of a movie. I was focused for the entire time.
I was in it. Yeah, I was. Yeah. I feel totally the same way. Go see it. I'm gonna probably go see it a second time. But so we went to the theater with a few people. Last thing, and we asked them to send us questions.
Okay.
And so we have a couple questions, and if you have any questions after this episode, if you're still with us, these episodes are going to start being put on YouTube. So once these are on YouTube, you go into the comment section if you ask questions, and we'll try to get as many questions at one point, and maybe we'll have a Q&A at some point as a podcast. Okay. So if this is going to be on YouTube, go in the comment section, ask questions if you have any, and we'll try to address questions as we can. But some of these questions that were asked, I had a student email me. They asked about why wasn't Geiger counters heard more throughout the movie. To put this question into context, they took our radiochem class where there's always Geiger counter noise going on. There's always monitoring. Any radio lab or Rad Lab you go into, there's always Geiger counters going off. There's always a beep. You gotta learn to love that sound.
Most of the old equipment was visual, and it had these vacuum tubes that went around and lit up 1 to 10. And so you would have a series of those tubes, and they would, you would see the lights flickering. And and they weren't nice, small, handheld Geiger counters at that point in time.
Yeah.
They were much larger because they were based on vacuum tubes, and the technology wasn't there to build these nice handheld ones.
Yeah, and that's a question I would have never thought of, because I'm like, oh yeah, they're big machines. They're not. It's not like it is today. That was a great question by by my student. Another question was, I guess I'd never thought about this question, maybe because I know the history about it, but they were like, did they use a less amount of plutonium because there was so little in the test of plutonium?
No, they used
the whole thing because it had to go critical.
Yeah.
But I think that was a fair question, because people, they make it seem so precious, and it was, that maybe they would use less than necessary, but no, they had to use all of it.
Yeah.
And if we want to go into the science about it, we'll talk about that in a later podcast. We'll go more into the Manhattan Project, more into the atomic bomb when we go a little bit deeper. But yes, they had to use a full amount of plutonium for that experiment.
Right.
I don't know if we mentioned why they didn't test the uranium bomb.
Basically because they were certain that it would work. And it used a gun mechanism where it shot a subcritical piece into another subcritical piece to make a critical mass. They were certain that it would work.
Yeah, and the math proved it. And like, to me, that still seems a little crazy that they knew it would work, but the science all backs up, it all checks out, and you just gotta go critical. And is it also true like that uranium's criticality event was like slower, that it happened slow enough that a gun mechanism would work, but plutonium was too fast? Right. Or more energetic?
No, the plutonium, it was the spontaneous fission neutrons that were given off by plutonium-240. That was a small contaminant in 239.
Got you.
And so it would be brought together, but there were enough spontaneous neutrons from spontaneous fission that it would basically start to work and then fizzle.
So it would start blowing itself apart before it could really get going.
Before it really got small enough.
Yeah. This is the last question from our students. They asked, how big of an explosion would it take to actually ignite the atmosphere? Probably big enough that it would destroy the world, so it wouldn't really matter. It's such a small possibility.
Right, and you have to realize that the amount of fission that took place is not 100%. And I can't remember exactly what they said, but I think they only had a 20% fission yield. And so we're talking about a very small area that the fission actually undergoes, and then it basically blows everything apart so that it stops. And so that the calculations that I believe is Hans Bertha did were, when he did his final calculations, he showed that it would not happen.
I think that was a great scene as well. I went 0.
Yeah.
But, okay, well, thank you for listening. Again, if you have any questions, these will be put on YouTube. Get into the comments section. We'll try to answer when we can. And look out for more episodes of the Rad Lab podcast, brought to you by Tennessee Tech University. And if you would like to learn more about Tennessee Tech and more about us, it'll be in the bio. Thanks for listening.